Hello and welcome back. In this tutorial, we are going to look at multiple exceptions and the way that we can handle them. I got a basic program set up in Eclipse. Let's create a new class here. I'm gonna name this class Multiple Exceptions and click Finish. I'll create a method and make it public void. I am gonna call it Start. Let's say that start method throws some exception, or it could throw an exception, because it's very rare to use a method that automatically throws an exception unless it's some kind of none-implemented exception. Let's just say that we detected an error, and then we want to throw a new IO exception. Now I'm going to have to add a throws clause here. So let's just click the error and import IO exception, click it again, and then cut the throws declaration. So if you want to throw an exception, then you're going to have this throws and exception name there. But what if you want to throw another exception because this exception might not get thrown in your code because this specific thing might not go wrong? And it could be that something else goes wrong somewhere in your code. So maybe we've got through the input-output stage, and we didn't throw IO exception, but now another error occurs in the same block of code, and we want to throw a new parse exception. So we want to say, for example, error at line 10. Therefore, you might throw parse exception if you are passing something that don't follow the format you expected. I've got one unhandled exception. Let's click on the error and go to add throws exception. So now we've got a comma-separated list of exceptions. Keep in mind that this is not a list of exceptions that we're gonna throw, because you can only throw one exception at a time. And you might not throw any exception at all if the code is successful. Instead, this means that you could throw either one of these two exceptions if something goes wrong in the code. So these are two separated things that could go wrong, and for each one you can throw a specific exception. So basically you can add any number of possible exceptions to this comma-separated list of exceptions. Let's have a look now at how you'd actually handle them. I'll create an object here of type multiple exceptions. So multiple exceptions ME equals new multiple exceptions. Then I'm gonna call ME start. Now I'm forced to handle those exceptions because ME start could throw either two exceptions, although it might not throw any if everything runs smoothly. So we've got a bunch of different options for handling that. And we've already seen the add throws declaration option, which will throw this out to main in this case. It throws it up to the next method in the hierarchy of method calls. Here we'll be throwing it directly out of the main method, which will produce some kind of stack trace if that error gets thrown. Now let's assume that you don't want to throw it out of main method, but instead you want to handle it. The first thing you can do is surround it with try and catch block. Although you've only got one try block, you can add multiple catch blocks, and depending on what error is thrown, you'll get into one of these blocks. So in this case, I'm actually throwing a parse exception. So I could say here, sysout, incorrect, format, or you can write here anything you think is appropriate. If we run this, then we get the error because we've thrown the exception. And this specific catch block has run, rather than this one, because the catch block will match its argument here to the actual exception that's thrown. This catches IO exceptions, and this catches parse exceptions, and we've thrown a parse exception. So we've run this code here. Now let's comment this out. Let's do me start again, and let's try another way of handling multiple exceptions. This way is called try multi-catch. So if I click the error here, I can say surround with try multi-catch. Now we've got a single catch block, but it lists two possible exceptions, and there is a vertical bar in the middle of them. You can add multiple exceptions there. So this can handle multiple exceptions in one catch block, and that's the try multi-catch. There is something else we could do to handle multiple exceptions. Let's say me start again. We have already seen the concept of polymorphism, which means that you can always pass a child class wherever a parent class is expected. Let's surround it with try and catch block. Now all exceptions classes derive from the parent class exception. If I change this to exception, it can now catch any kind of exception, because this is the parent class of all exception classes, and this would catch any child class. It can catch an IO exception, a parse exception, or any child class of exception. And that brings up an issue here. Supposing I've got a public void method here. Let's call this method example. Now let's say that this method can throw an IO exception, and for some reason, it could also throw a file not found exception, which is a child class of IO exception. I'll just add the import statement for that here. Now, if you think about how to handle that, I'll go to app here. Imagine we are running me example, which throws file not found exception, or it might throw IO exception. And imagine that I surround it with try and catch block. We have to have file not found exception first. And the reason for that is that if we had IO exception first here, then IO exception would catch file not found exception as well. What happens is Java goes down the catch blocks and says, does this match the exception? If yes, then we'll run this code. If it doesn't, let's look at the other catch block. Does this match the exception? If yes, then we'll run this block. And if we had IO exception here and file not found exception here, it would say, okay, file not found exception is an IO exception. It's a child class of it, and it would run this, and we would never reach this. For that reason, I think if we were to say here, file not found exception, and I were to put IO exception here, it won't even compile. So let's save this, and it will say here, unreachable catch block, and that's because we've handled them in the wrong order. So keep it in mind that if you got a child exception, you've got to handle it first before the parent, because otherwise the parent would catch it because of polymorphism. And that's it for this lecture. In the next one, we're going to look a little bit more into two different kinds of exceptions: runtime and checked exceptions. So I'll see you there.